Dr. Craig, we've been busy taking some questions from some groups on Facebook and other social media. Group on Facebook, Christian Apologetics Alliance. We will take a couple more questions from them. And I also invited the group Challenging Christianity, mostly comprised of atheists and agnostics and skeptics, non-theists, to ask some questions as well. We got a couple from them that we'll go to. Finishing up with the Christian Apologetics group, Chris says, C.S. Lewis wrote that he believes stories could, quote, steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I'm curious what Bill's take is on this kind of imaginative apologetics. Have we overlooked capturing a person's imagination and helping them want Christianity to be true, along with providing reasons and evidence for it?
This issue came up at the conference that I participated in Westminster Abbey on the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death 2 years ago. And I'd refer Chris to the videos of that conference as well as the book that is forthcoming based on it. And I would really agree with him that imaginative apologetics is something that is valuable and important, but it's just not my calling. I think there's a division of labor, and I have chosen to work upon theism and the historicity of certain events in the life of Jesus. And so I haven't worked in areas like film and poetry and fantasy and so forth, but I'm all for those who are working in those areas. We have a different calling, and the body of Christ is gifted in such a way that different people can take different approaches.
Okay. Mikhail asked, if we apply Leibnizian question to God and ask, why is there God rather than nothing? The response would be, because God is a necessary being, he cannot not exist. But why is there a necessary being rather than no being? Isn't it simpler to have no being rather than a necessary being? What determines the necessity of the being?
I don't think that Mikhail has really grasped the question, pardon me, I don't think that Mikhail has really grasped the notion of a self-existent being. This is a being which is such that if it is possible, then it exists necessarily. So the question, well, why is there a necessary being rather than nothing, is a meaningless question. God's nature is such that if he is possible, then he exists. And there isn't any further question as to why there is a necessary being. God exists by a necessity of his own nature.
He asks a second question, can we somehow derive the concept that God is tripersonal from his ontology? Does there have to be more than one person in order for love to be manifested? Okay, wait a minute. There does have to be more than one person in order for love to be manifested between them, but why 3 persons? Why not 2 or 4?
I'm inclined to agree with Thomas Aquinas on the Trinity, that this is a revealed truth based on Scripture and not one that you discover by natural reason. I think he's right that you can give plausibility arguments for there being a plurality of persons in God based upon the essential character of love, to give oneself to another. But as he says, that will get you 2 persons in the deity, but it wouldn't get you exactly 3. And so I don't see that as something that we can derive deductively from the fact that God exists.
Okay. I invited this group as well, Dr. Craig, to suggest what they think are some of the more pressing issues in Christian philosophy and apologetics. Clinton says homosexuality is a huge one. Our stance on same-sex marriage and homosexuality being a sin seems to be a deal breaker for many atheists.
Now, let me just say here, I don't think that the Christian stance is that homosexuality is a sin. Homosexuality is an orientation which may be beyond a person's choice. What would be a sin would be acting out and committing homosexual acts. That's proscribed by the Bible in the same way that any sort of activity outside of marriage is proscribed by the Bible.
So we're making the difference between the orientation and the behavior.
Right. But nevertheless, he's right in saying that this certainly is a deal breaker for a lot of non-Christians. They simply cannot come to believe that God would proscribe homosexual behavior for certain persons. And I guess there I would try to appeal to some degree of intellectual humility on their part, say, how do you know what God would prescribe? Maybe you're wrong. If God were to proscribe eating red beans, as the ancient Pythagoreans thought, well, then I think that would be wrong. And apart from God, where are you going to get any moral duties? Where will you get any moral prescriptions or proscriptions if you deny that God exists? And so if you need God to ground morality, you cannot ignore the question, well, what does God think about this behavior? And how can you be so confident that God has prohibited this sort of behavior? I think there needs to be a degree of intellectual modesty about this, but still, Clinton is absolutely right that it's a deal breaker for many.
Yeah, he says, I'd say mainly social issues are confronting Christianity today because even the abortion issue is seen as a religious issue. If Christianity doesn't start to lean in a more progressive direction, many atheists don't want anything to do with it. In fact, many Christians don't want anything to do with a conservative Christianity.
I think he's right, and that is my great fear, that out of a desire to win atheists or non-believers to gospel, people will begin to compromise and start to lean in what he calls a more progressive direction. And I think that is simply to betray biblical Christianity. You cannot change the truth out of a desire to make it palatable to people, what they want to hear. In fact, we're warned against that in the New Testament, aren't we? That false teachers are those who will tell people what they want to hear. The Bible calls those people with itching ears, and you will tell them whatever will scratch those ears and make them feel good. And at some point, our efforts to make our gospel or make the truth winsome will cease, and there will be the offense of the gospel to people. And then we simply have to trust God to open their hearts by his Spirit's conviction and draw them to him. But I think that the sort of thinking that if we don't lean in a progressive direction, Christianity will die, that is the old message that the mainline neoliberal denominations have been saying for decades, Kevin. And you've seen what has happened to them in Europe and in the United States. This is a prescription for the suicide of the church. And there's good empirical evidence for that. Look at the recent Pew study on religious affiliation in this country. The mainline denominations are in free fall, losing members, whereas evangelical Christianity is holding its own and even increasing in terms of absolute numbers. So it is really misguided and counterproductive to compromise biblical truth out of a desire to make it palatable to a secular culture.
Jordan asks, since Dr. Craig is an anti-realist about abstracta, how does he account for the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? Seems to me that one would have to simply concede that this is just some sort of brute fact.
I would say that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom no more exist as entities or objects than do ordinary propositions. These are useful fictions for talking about the way the world is. But that's all they are. We can adopt language of propositions or counterfactuals to usefully discourse about how things are or how they would have been. But that doesn't commit us ontologically to their reality. That doesn't mean that they're just some sort of brute fact. That's getting into the question of the grounding objection, which we've already addressed elsewhere. In the same way that you don't need, I think, indicative propositions, you don't need counterfactual propositions, you would just find these to be useful devices for talking about the way the world is. For example, Kevin, the truth predicate, is true, is a way of ascending semantically to talk about a proposition rather than talking about the way the world is. So I could say, for example, Hitler was evil. Or I could ascend semantically and say, it is true that Hitler was evil. And in the second case, I'm no longer talking about Hitler, I'm talking about the proposition and ascribing a truth value to it. It is true that P, where P is Hitler, was evil. Or you could make that a counterfactual proposition. So the truth predicate, I think, is simply a way of ascending semantically, but it isn't something that's a genuine sort of property of objects that actually exist. Anytime you say it is true or it is false, that, you can just descend semantically, and instead of saying it's true that we're going out to dinner tonight, and just descend and say we're going out to dinner tonight. And you don't need to bring in the truth predicate. So I think that there isn't any problem here for the anti-realist with respect to propositions of any sort.
Okay. Eugene says, what advice does Dr. Craig have for someone who's going into ministry? It's about 12 years down the road because I'm going for a doctorate in biblical studies, and I'm going to start a ministry after that. What does a ministry entail in terms of how it runs and operates? And let me continue, Bill, maybe you can take it all. He says, would it be a better idea for me to become a professor of biblical studies on a Christian campus or a secular one? I've been thinking it would be better on a secular campus because there are more opportunities to reach out to those who are lost instead of just preaching to the choir. Thanks.
There are so many levels on which one could answer a question like this. Since Eugene is a fellow, I would say that one of the very most important things he could do, if he hasn't done so already, is to find a wife who will be 100% supportive of his vision in life and what he wants to do. I think that having a mate who is yoked with you in a common task in ministry will be the greatest strength that he could have. Whereas being united with someone who is pursuing an independent path and isn't very enthusiastic or supportive about him is going to make his ministry very much more difficult to carry out. So I would say that would be the most important thing that he could do in preparing for his ministry. I'd also encourage him to get the very best education that he can. The years spent in study, and particularly doctoral study, are invaluable. That opportunity may never come again. And so he needs to apply himself diligently to getting the very best education that he can get in preparation for ministry. I'd also encourage him to try to have a clear vision of what area of ministry he wants to go into. It does seem like he's interested here in biblical studies, but it would also be helpful for him to get some philosophy under his belt. I find that those who are doing biblical studies are often quite naive philosophically and so can fall prey to philosophical errors or conceptual confusion because they haven't been trained in good analytic philosophy. Finally, with respect to a specific question, it's difficult to know whether to be affiliated with a Christian campus or a secular one. I have been in Christian education for my career path, and I have really loved it. That it forms a supportive community that is very strengthening and helpful. On the other hand, he certainly will have more of an impact in reaching out to the lost if he's on a secular university campus. But then the sort of pressures of political correctness and other forces may come to bear upon him in a difficult way. So that's a choice that will be a matter of his individual calling that he'll have to weigh.
Wes says, a friend who was once a Christian said that reading the Gnostic Gospels found in the last century, interweaved in the Gnostic idea of dualism, opened him to profound ideas that changed his faith and ultimate reality of soul, spirit, and body. The authenticity of each of the Gnostics' Gospels is very weak and was very publicized to be true lost Gospels. And I want to know Dr. Craig's views on those books and what I can do to firmly underline the difference in reliability in the New Testament true Gospels and these false Gnostic Gospels.
I think there's no doubt at all that the canonical Gospels are the primary sources for the life of Jesus that are closest to the time of Jesus and those who were with Jesus and knew him, compared to these later Gnostic Gospels, which arose not before the second half of the 2nd century after Christ, and even much later than that. They really originate not in Christian thinking, but in pagan philosophy. And then Jesus is adopted as a sort of sock puppet to become a marionette or spokesperson for Gnostic philosophy. So these are forgeries under the apostles' names from centuries later than Christ. Everybody knew it at the time, and there's no reason whatsoever to think that these give us much insight into what the historical Jesus said or did. Craig Evans, a fine historical Jesus scholar, remarked to me a couple years ago that the Nag Hammadi documents, which for some were so hopeful as new sources of Jesus, have panned out to be virtually worthless, and that those who championed them are now really desperate to find any sort of shred of historical material in them that would be or would illuminate or shed light on the life and teachings of Jesus. They've just proved to be really quite worthless, says Craig.
Okay. TW says, I'd like to know if Dr. Craig knows Food Network star Alton Brown. I know Brown used to attend Johnson Ferry Baptist Church.
She is right. And we have seen Alton Brown here at the church on occasion, but I have never had the occasion to meet him personally. But Jan and I do enjoy watching him on the Food Network. I think he's very entertaining, and he is, or at least was, a member here at Johnson Ferry Baptist.
You need to invite him over to show you some cooking skills.
Yeah,
no?
We should have him cook for a reasonable faith dinner.
That would be awesome. Daniel says, I have another question on abstract objects. On Dr. Craig's nominalist view, when he says a given abstract object does not actually exist, such as properties, is he saying properties are not factual features of reality, or simply that they do not exist independently of that to which they are associated?
I'm saying the former. They are not actual features of reality. They're useful fictions, like useful fictions in science, like the frictionless plane or points at infinity, things of that sort. Talk of properties is very useful for discoursing about objects that exist. But I would say that it is just that. It's a façon de parler. It's a manner of speaking. It's a useful fiction that we use to say things in a convenient way. But there isn't any reason to think that there really are these mind-independent objects out there called properties. So I would take an anti-realist view of these things.
Okay. On to Challenging Christianity, the group on Facebook, mostly made up of atheists, skeptics, agnostics, non-theists. And our friend Scott Clifton says, Dr. Craig denies that our intuitions about causality, for example, the causal principle, are reducible to inferences, conscious or subconscious, derived from our empirical experience of the world. Yet, at the same time, he maintains that without our empirical experience of the world, we couldn't possibly have the intuitions we do. To me, this sounds a bit like saying just because Bob isn't married doesn't mean he's a bachelor, without further explanation. I'd much appreciate Dr. Craig unpacking his position in a way that sufficiently reconciles these two theses.
I'm not quite sure what Scott is talking about here. I think he may be referring to my suggestion that maybe Kant was correct in thinking that the causal principle, which I would express as saying everything that begins to exist has a cause, is a synthetic a priori principle. And what Kant meant by that was that it's not true just by definition. From the analysis of the concept begins to exist, you cannot derive by definition that that thing had a cause. So this is a synthetic statement, not a merely analytic or definitional statement. But Kant said it's a priori. And what he meant by that is that it's universal and necessarily true. This is not just dependent upon contingent facts of reality. This is a universal necessary truth. And that doesn't mean that you don't learn about this truth through human experience. Kant would say that 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a synthetic a priori truth, but he would say that you may come to learn about it by your experience of counting, for example, but the universality and necessity of that isn't based on that experience, even if it arises as a result of that experience. And I think my suggestion was that could be true, well, as Kant believed, of the causal principle. Experiencing the world, experiencing things coming into being. In experience, this idea arises in one's mind that whatever begins to exist has a cause. But it isn't based upon that experience in the sense of its justification depends upon inferences from experience. Rather, it's a universal and necessary truth which one comes to apprehend and experience. Now, I don't want to insist on the a priori nature of this as being something that isn't based on experience, because in contemporary philosophical thought, especially since the time of Saul Kripke, the idea of metaphysically necessary a posteriori truths has come to be appreciated. For example, take the truth that gold has the atomic number 79. That seems to be a metaphysically necessary truth. As Kant would say, it is universal and necessary. If something didn't have the atomic number 79, it just wouldn't be the element gold. But this is not something you know apart from experience or a priori. You only know it through experience. You come to know it through experience, but then you see that it's necessary in its truth. Or take the statement that this table could not have been made of ice. Now, certainly I could have had a table made of ice that was the same shape and size as this one, but it wouldn't be this table. The statement, this table could not have been made of ice, seems to be necessarily true. And yet we come to know it a posteriori by experiencing the table. And I would think in the same way, it's very plausible to say that the causal principle could be necessarily true. It's a metaphysically necessary truth, even though it's come to be known a posteriori. So either way is fine with me. I'm not going to insist on it. In fact, the argument that I give for the existence of God doesn't even depend on this being a necessary truth. All it needs to be is just true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, whatever might be the case in other worlds, though I'm inclined to think it's a metaphysically necessary truth. So I hope that's helpful to Scott in seeing that this shouldn't be a stumbling block for him in accepting the first premise of the cosmological argument.
Yeah. On a kind of related note, Bill, you've differentiated between things which have a cause and events which have a cause.
That's right. You notice that I reworded Kant's causal principle. The principle that Kant believed was synthetic a priori was actually that every event has a cause. But the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't commit you to so radical a view as that. I wanted to have a more modest formulation of the causal principle, namely everything that begins to exist has a cause. And that would be perfectly compatible with saying that there are events that are indeterministic, such as quantum decay events or libertarian free choices. So one could reject the Kantian principle that every event has a cause, and yet hold to the principle that I think is the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, that if anything, substance, comes into existence, there's a cause for why that exists rather than not.
Christopher asked, Dr. Craig, for about a year I've been interested in the work of a website called New Apologetics. I think that among their best work is their Theodicy. Their Theodicy, called the Theodicy of Divine Chastity, attempts to explain the coexisting of God with evil while maintaining that God remains perfectly opposed to every instance of evil and suffering in the world. Their claim is that the reason God doesn't prevent evil is that he isn't morally free to do so, as to do so would be to hold back his self-gift to created persons of freedom and importance of their actions. This would also contrast with your view of Molinism, as on TDC, this Theodicy, God's focus in creation is on the persons he creates, not on outcomes, such as the existence of evil, who does or doesn't go to hell, etc. He creates persons and in a sense gives them the ability to become co-creators in a way. I'm wondering what you think about this Theodicy. Is it superior to more popular theodicies that are used, that usually involve God allowing evil so he can use it as a means to an end?
Well, I have some questions about this Theodicy. They claim that on this view, God remains perfectly opposed to every instance of evil and suffering. Now, I certainly would think that God, as a morally perfect being, is opposed to every instance of evil. But where do they derive the conclusion that he is therefore opposed to every instance of suffering? Why couldn't God allow or inflict suffering upon people for purposes of, say, judgment upon sin, or for purposes of discipline, or trial to improve character, or something of that sort? Or perhaps he has other purposes to achieve. I am not at all confident. In fact, I doubt seriously, I'm very skeptical of the idea that an all-good God would not permit suffering. C.S. Lewis once made the point, what do people mean when they say, I don't fear God because I know that he is good? Have they never been to the dentist? There can be reasons for inflicting suffering on people. And so I'm just not at all confident that the idea that because God is perfectly good, that he cannot allow people to suffer, even inflict suffering. So having that kind of natural evil, if you will, would not be to hold back his self-gift to created persons of freedom. This seems to me to be really just the free will theodicy with respect to moral evil, that I don't see any difference between the free will defense and this theodicy with respect to moral evil. God allows people to make morally evil choices that he's opposed to out of his respect for their freedom. And that is the free will defense. But then you've got to say something more, at least, about natural evil and about suffering in order to explain that, and he hasn't done that in this email at least. I'm a little puzzled too why he says this would contrast with Molinism, as on Theodicy of divine chastity, God's focus in creation is on the persons he creates. I think that's true of Molinism, that God's focus is on the persons he creates, and particularly bringing these persons into a saving relationship with himself, on their salvation. And so his focus really is on persons. And on Molinism, he creates persons and gives them the ability to become co-creators of the world. We are co-actualizers of the world with God. God places us in a certain set of freedom-permitting circumstances, and then he stands back and lets us choose freely which choice we would like to make, and thereby we determine which world becomes actual. We are co-actualizers of the world along with God on a Molinist view. So I don't see any advantages to this view over Molinism, and I do see insufficiencies in this view insofar as it doesn't address the problem of suffering that isn't due to human freedom.
We have time for one more question. On the last page here, Dr. Craig, from this group, it says, Dr. Craig, I found that many Christians who seek out apologetics online are hanging on to their faith by a thread. And while the arguments presented help some, a good number eventually fall away despite trying their hardest to hold on. While some might reject their faith for emotional reasons, a significant number of former believers fall away for intellectual reasons, and they experience intense emotional pain caused by the separation rather than preceding it. In other words, they are very reluctant agnostics. Do you accept that there are people out there like this? People who sincerely believed Christianity was true, who wanted to continue believing, but who were ultimately convinced that the arguments for God just don't hold up? If not, does this mean that all apostates are lying when they convey these apparently honest sentiments? And if you do accept that such people exist, does that mean Paul was incorrect in Romans 1 when he claimed that God has made it plain to everyone that he exists? Because to many of us, it is not plain at all. I think my question has relevance even if the number of people who study and fall away is tiny. Even if one person on earth sincerely tries to believe but can't convince themselves, that seems to be a problem since they are damned as a result. Kevin, if you and Dr. Craig are committed to what Paul says, you must believe that there is not a single person on the entire planet who has sought God through apologetics and remained sincerely unconvinced, but that seems like an extraordinary claim.
Yeah. What Brian is presupposing here is a religious epistemology of evidentialism. And I've made it abundantly clear I am not an evidentialist. So, certainly I believe that there are people who sincerely believe Christianity is true, who wanted to continue believing, but who ultimately became convinced that the arguments for God don't hold up. But what I would deny is that those persons should then become apostates. Rather, we have a dual warrant for our faith. Not only the arguments and evidence, but also the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. And even if the arguments and the evidence should prove unconvincing because of the historical vicissitudes in which a person finds himself, for example, say a believer who goes off to study theology at a German university and so lacks the resources for refuting the liberal professors that attack his faith, or a student living in the Soviet Union during the era of Marxist indoctrination who has no means of refuting the atheistic propaganda against Christianity. Such a person would be unconvinced that the arguments for God hold up. They might think, oh, they've all been refuted. But that would require the person to apostatize only if you presuppose the truth of evidentialism, which is what I think Brian is presupposing. And I don't hold to that. So I'm not committed to the extraordinary claim that he makes at the end, there is not a single person on this planet who has sought God through apologetics and remained sincerely unconvinced. Of course, there are lots of people like that, and lots of Christians who are like that, who don't believe in God because of the evidence and the arguments. They're unconvinced by those things. But that doesn't mean that therefore they're unbelievers, because they have a different warrant for their belief in Christianity, and that warrant is the witness of the Holy Spirit. So Brian needs to engage more seriously with the possibility that an all-loving and omnipotent God would not abandon us to the vicissitudes of time and place in history, the shifting sands of evidence, for our eternal salvation. But would it supply to us, in addition to that, a warrant for the truth of the Christian faith that is independent of the vicissitudes of history and the evidence that may or may not be available at any particular time and place to a person? And it is that I think can enable a person to believe rationally and warrantedly, to know that Christianity is true, even if he comes to have doubts that any of the apologetic arguments and evidence hold up.
Bill, it seems like a huge burden of proof that one would bear if one says, there exists a person who sought God with all his heart and was sincere, and God never responded, and God let him die without responding, and that person is condemned.
Right, and Kevin, if that were the claim Brian was talking about, I would make that claim. There is no single person who has sincerely and earnestly sought God whom God has abandoned to hell and unbelief, and would not meet him in some way to give him warrant. But where Brian, you see, falsely assumes is that God will do this through apologetics.
Yeah.
And that's not right. There's no reason to think that whatsoever.
Yeah. And Brian could say, well, that person is me. I've sought God with all my heart. The thing
It
is...
does sound very autobiographical.
Well, and the thing is, you're not dead yet. I mean...
Right, okay, there are 2 points you're making here, Kevin. One is, you're not dead yet. God may yet give you good arguments and evidence that will convince you. But then I think the more fundamental point is the one that I'm making, is that you are not cast upon arguments and evidence alone for your eternal salvation and to find the knowledge of God.
Absolutely.
And that's the assumption behind his question, that there's not a single person on the planet who has sincerely sought God through apologetics and remained unconvinced by the arguments. We're not making that claim.
I want to thank these groups on Facebook for their tremendous questions, and we'll do this again sometime, so keep it right here on A Reasonable Faith with Dr. William Lane Craig.